I'm Audrey, a 21-year-old law student at Boston University, and I live in our beautiful family estate in the suburbs. Well, technically, my estate now. My father left it to me when he passed away 3 years ago from a sudden cardiac arrest. I was only 18 then, just starting my first year, when we got that devastating call. One minute Dad was fine, the next he was gone. Even now, the memory catches in my throat. The house is a piece of New England history, a stately Victorian with detailed woodwork that makes passersby stop and stare. The wraparound porch, the perfectly manicured lawn, and a gourmet kitchen that would make professional chefs envious. I live here with my mom, Patricia, who's 48. Dad made sure she'd be taken care of too, leaving her a monthly allowance of $33,000 for life. She surprised me with how gracefully she handled everything after the will was read. No arguments, no complaints about me getting the house. She just smiled and said Dad knew what he was doing. That's one of the things I've always loved about my mom, her ability to handle difficult situations with poise and dignity. We settled into a comfortable routine after Dad's passing. Mom and I became even closer, if that was possible. She'd cook my favorite breakfast every morning, blueberry pancakes with real maple syrup, crispy bacon, and freshly brewed coffee. We'd talk about my law classes, share stories about our days, discuss cases I was studying. Everything felt stable, secure. Well, at least I thought it was. That's why what happened at last month's dinner party hit me like a sledgehammer. The dinner party. I walked into Carmen's, one of Boston's most exclusive Italian restaurants, expecting a normal Friday night dinner with Mom. Instead, I found her seated at an elaborately decorated table with a man I'd never seen before and two boys. The crystal glasses sparkled under the chandelier light, white roses arranged artfully in the center. Clearly, this had been planned. "Audrey, darling," Mom stood up, her voice carrying that artificial brightness I'd never heard before. "I'd like you to meet Marcus, my husband." I froze mid-step, my hand still clutching my purse. Husband? I must have looked like a deer in headlights, my mouth opening and closing without any sound coming out. "We got married yesterday," she continued, as if she was telling me about a new recipe she'd tried. Marcus was younger than Mom. I'd later learn he was 42, 6 years her junior. His sons, Noah and Lucas, aged 12 and 14, sat perfectly still behind him, smartphones clutched in their hands. But what really knocked the wind out of me wasn't just the shock of Mom remarrying. It was the fact that she hadn't breathed a word about dating someone. No hints, no conversations, not even a casual mention of meeting someone new. Just surprise. "Here's your new stepfather and stepbrothers." I watched in stunned silence as Marcus expertly navigated the restaurant, greeting the sommelier by name, discussing vintage wines with practiced ease. When he returned to our table, he began inspecting me with the same calculating gaze he'd used on the wine list. "Audrey," he smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Patricia has told me so much about you." Law school, isn't it? Fascinating choice. Something about his tone made my skin crawl, but I pushed the feeling aside. Throughout the dinner, Marcus played the part of the perfect gentleman, asking about my studies, making polished jokes, keeping his sons occupied with their phones. This could work, I remember thinking naively to myself as I picked at my overpriced pasta. Maybe we could actually get along. I had no idea how wrong I was. 2 days later, that illusion of potential harmony lasted exactly 48 hours. Then reality crashed into our peaceful home like a wrecking ball. "Give it back." "It's my turn, Noah." Lucas's voice pierced through my concentration, bouncing off the walls of our previously quiet house. "No way." "I just started," Noah screamed back. And there they went again, their thundering footsteps echoing through the halls, as they chased each other with my laptop between them. This wasn't an isolated incident. It became my new daily reality. These boys fought over everything: the TV remote, the last cookie in the jar, which chair belonged to whom at dinner, even who got to use the upstairs bathroom first in the morning. The peaceful Victorian home that had been my sanctuary was now a battleground. Study session interrupted. One particularly memorable afternoon, I was deep into studying for a crucial constitutional law exam. The complex cases about Fourth Amendment rights required complete concentration, and I had finally gotten into a good rhythm when it crashed. My bedroom door flew open with such force it slammed against the wall, and in tumbled Noah and Lucas, a tornado of flying fists and accusations. "Get out!" I jumped up from my desk, my carefully organized case briefs scattering to the floor. "This is my room." He took the controller when I was winning. Noah whined, his face red with anger. "You weren't even playing right," Lucas shot back, shoving his brother into my bookshelf. My constitutional law textbook hit the floor with a sickening thud, its pages crumpling beneath its weight. "Dad," Lucas's voice echoed through the house. "Noah's cheating again." Marcus appeared in my doorway moments later, leaning against the frame with an expression of amused indifference. He was wearing one of his designer suits. I'd noticed he had a closet full of them now, all purchased with Mom's allowance. "Come on, Audrey," he said smoothly, checking his gold watch. "They're just figuring things out." This is how young men learn to handle conflict. By destroying my room and interrupting my studies, I asked, my voice tight with controlled anger. The mock trial competition was in 2 days, and I needed every minute of preparation I could get. Patricia materialized behind Marcus, her hand resting on his shoulder in what had become her signature pose. "Marcus is right, honey," she said, her voice carrying that new, placating tone. "The boys are just being boys. They need space to work out their differences." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Every day it was the same thing: constant fighting, screaming, things getting broken. And apparently this was all perfectly fine with their father, and increasingly with my mother. The woman who had once insisted on proper behavior and respect for others' space was now watching our home descend into chaos with a serene smile. The family meeting. But Marcus wasn't done asserting his dominance. One evening, he gathered everyone in the living room for what he called a family meeting. He stood in the center of the room, surveying our historic Victorian home like a real estate agent assessing a potential flip. "This house needs a complete overhaul," he announced, his voice carrying that practiced sales pitch tone. "Everything's too traditional, too dated. We need to renovate. Modern furniture, contemporary color scheme, the works." I sat up straighter in my father's antique leather armchair. "Excuse me? Look at all this." He gestured dismissively at the carefully preserved woodwork, the vintage light fixtures, the family portraits, the Victorian style, the antiques. "It's like living in a museum. We need something more contemporary, more befitting a modern family home." His eyes lingered on Dad's prized grandfather clock in the corner. "This is my house," I said firmly, feeling my heart rate accelerate. "Dad left it to me, not to Mom, and definitely not to you. Any changes to this house will be my decision." Marcus's polished facade cracked slightly. "Listen, Audrey." His voice dropped to that smooth, condescending tone he used in difficult sales negotiations. "Legal ownership is just paperwork. What matters is who lives here and who's the head of the household." As the man of the house, I stood up from the armchair, my law books forgotten on the side table. "Let me make something crystal clear," I interrupted, channeling the courtroom confidence my trial advocacy professor had been drilling into us. "You don't command anything in this house. You live here because you're my mother's husband, and your sons are here only because I allow it. The change in Marcus's expression was instantaneous, like watching a mask of civility crack and fall away. His carefully maintained smile vanished, replaced by something cold and calculating. In 3 measured steps, he was standing directly in front of me, using his height to loom over me in a practiced intimidation technique. "Listen here, you entitled little princess," he said, his voice dropping to that dangerous whisper real estate agents use when threatening competitors. "I won't have some college student telling me what I can and can't do in my own home." "It's not your home," I repeated, standing my ground, even as my pulse raced. "And it never will be." What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Marcus's face flushed with that particular shade of red I'd seen on angry clients in the law clinic, and his hand twitched upward in a controlled motion. The movement was subtle but clear in its intent. Mom gasped from across the room, but I didn't flinch. Instead, I pulled my phone from my pocket and held it up, my finger hovering over the emergency call button. "Go ahead," I said, my voice as steady as during mock trial practice. "Give me a reason to call the police. I'm sure they'd be very interested in hearing about a real estate broker threatening his stepdaughter in her own home." The confrontation's aftermath. The threat of legal consequences worked like a bucket of ice water. Marcus's hand dropped immediately, his real estate broker instincts kicking in. Never leave evidence of threatening behavior. Without another word, he turned and strode up the stairs, his expensive shoes echoing against the hardwood. "Audrey, honey," Mom rushed forward, wringing her hands in that new nervous habit she developed since meeting Marcus. "There's no need for things to get so confrontational. Marcus is just trying to adjust to our family dynamic. He needs time to feel established." I stared at my mother, trying to recognize the strong, independent woman who'd raised me. The woman who'd taught me to stand up for myself, to never let anyone intimidate me. "He needs to feel like the man of the house," Mom continued, her voice taking on that placating tone she now used constantly. "You know how important that is for successful men like Marcus, sweetie. Please try to understand." I looked at my mother's pleading face, my mind flashing back to our law school lectures on domestic psychological manipulation. Something inside me hardened. "You want to know what I think?" I raised my voice deliberately, making sure my words would carry upstairs. "When he earns enough from his real estate business to buy his own historic Victorian, he can modernize it however he wants. But this," I gestured around at the home my father had lovingly maintained, "isn't his property to renovate." The silence that followed was deafening. Then from upstairs, we heard heavy footsteps, followed by the sharp slam of a door, Marcus's signature move when he couldn't win an argument. The sound was so forceful, it made the vintage crystal chandelier tremble, its delicate pieces clinking together in protest. The changes begin. After the confrontation with Marcus, things in the house changed, but not in the dramatic way I'd expected. It started with breakfast. For as long as I could remember, mornings had been our special time. Mom would be in the kitchen by 7, humming softly while she worked her magic at the stove, the kitchen filled with the comforting aroma of freshly brewed coffee and blueberry pancakes. But now, the kitchen was silent in the mornings. The first time it happened, I thought maybe Mom had slept in. I came downstairs, my constitutional law textbook tucked under my arm, expecting to smell coffee and breakfast, only to find an empty kitchen. The vintage stove, the one Dad had specially restored, stood cold and unused. Through the dining room's bay windows, I could see Mom and Marcus in the garden, sharing coffee from the expensive new espresso machine he'd insisted on buying. I made myself some toast and tried not to think too much of it. Everyone needs a morning off sometimes, right? But it happened again the next day, and the next. Soon a week had passed, and the only sounds in the morning kitchen were the ones I made myself, fumbling around for cereal or bread while trying to review my case briefs. One morning, after watching another breakfast scene in the garden, Mom laughing at something Marcus had said while his sons played on their phones, I finally worked up the courage to ask about it. I found Mom in the living room, scrolling through luxury real estate listings while Marcus's boys argued over some game in the background. Mom, I started hesitantly, my hand resting on the back of Dad's armchair. Is everything okay? You haven't been cooking breakfast lately. She looked up from her tablet, and for a moment I saw something flicker across her face. Regret, maybe, but it was quickly replaced by that new, cool detachment I'd never seen before Marcus. Audrey, you're 21 now, she said, her voice matter of fact. You're a law student and perfectly capable of making your own breakfast. Besides, she gestured around at the Victorian woodwork Dad had lovingly maintained. This is your house, remember? You're the lady of the house now, so you should learn to take care of yourself. The words hit me like a case of summary judgment, swift and devastating. But I swallowed the hurt and nodded, not wanting to give Marcus, who was smirking from his position in Dad's chair, the satisfaction of seeing my pain. I turned and walked away, heading to the kitchen to make myself a solitary breakfast before my morning classes. Financial changes. As the days went by, I noticed other changes too. Mom's monthly allowance, the $33,000 Dad had carefully set aside to ensure her comfort, seemed to be evaporating faster than precedent in a changing court. I started seeing shopping bags from luxury boutiques appearing in our Victorian foyer. Gucci, Prada, Louis Vuitton. Marcus had developed an affinity for Boston's finest restaurants, and every other night they'd dress up and head out. Him in his new designer suits, her in expensive dresses. We're trying that new French place in Back Bay, Mom would announce, pulling on her coat while Marcus waited by the door, checking his gold watch. Don't wait up. I knew these restaurants, the kind where appetizers cost more than my law school textbooks, and every time they went out, my father's money, meticulously arranged to take care of her, was now funding romantic dinners with a man who had tried to intimidate his stepdaughter just weeks ago. The fancy restaurant dates weren't enough for Marcus's taste for luxury. Soon Mom and Patricia started taking weekend trips together. It began with romantic getaways to boutique hotels in the Berkshires, then evolved into longer excursions to beachfront resorts in the Hamptons and mountain lodges in Vermont. But their latest travel plan really took the argument to the Supreme Court, so to speak. Audrey, we need to talk, Mom said one evening, catching me as I was heading up to my room to prepare for mock trial. Her voice had that artificial sweetness she'd adopted since meeting Marcus. Marcus and I are planning a romantic getaway next week, just a few days in Nantucket, and we need you to watch the boys while we're gone. I actually laughed out loud, thinking she was joking, the kind of laugh you might give when a witness makes an obviously false statement. But when I saw her serious expression, my laughter died in my throat. Absolutely not, I said firmly, channeling my trial advocacy voice. Have you seen how they behave? They're like a walking civil liability. Right on cue, a crash echoed from upstairs, followed by the familiar sound of shouting. Mom winced, but pressed on. They're just active boys. Active? I cut her off, my objection immediate. They're a tart waiting to happen. What if one of them cracks the other's skull open during one of their fights? What if they break bones? I'm not assuming that liability. The argument. Please, Audrey, Mom begged, clutching my hand like a desperate witness on cross-examination. Marcus and I really need this time together. We've been planning this Nantucket trip for weeks. I pulled my hand away, my mind racing through precedents of similar disasters. Then take them with you. Or better yet, leave them with Marcus's mother. She only lives 15 minutes away in Brookline. Oh, she's too old to handle them, Mom said quickly, avoiding my eyes. And I'm too young? I shot back. Besides, I have commitments that week. I have my mock trial competition, case briefings do. The argument continued in our elegant hallway, Mom alternating between guilt trips and promises that the boys would behave. But I stood my ground like a defense attorney protecting their clients' rights. In the end, they had no choice but to take Noah and Lucas with them. The morning they left, our Victorian foyer felt like a courtroom after a particularly bitter verdict. Marcus stomped around, loading designer luggage into his leased BMW, scowling like he'd lost a major property deal. Mom barely said goodbye, just gave me a disappointed look that was supposed to make me feel guilty. The aftermath. The house felt wonderfully peaceful after they left, like a courthouse after hours. But their sour attitudes had become the new normal. Every day brought the same performance. Marcus and Mom walking around with thundercloud expressions, sighing heavily, and exchanging meaningful looks whenever I entered a room. It was like they were competing in some sort of most aggrieved party contest. Meanwhile, Noah and Lucas continued their daily warfare, turning our historic home into their personal battleground. Just yesterday, they'd had a full-on brawl over who got to use the smart TV first, complete with pushing, shoving, and enough screaming to disrupt a Supreme Court session. And Mom? She barely looked up from her phone, too busy planning their next expensive getaway. Property violations. As if the constant fighting wasn't bad enough, my stepbrothers developed a new hobby, helping themselves to my belongings whenever I was at law school. It started small, like a series of minor infractions. My wireless mouse disappeared one day, then my portable speaker the next. But soon they graduated to major violations of property rights. I came home from my constitutional law seminar one afternoon to find my tablet missing from my desk. When I confronted Noah and Lucas, they both performed their well-rehearsed innocent act. "Haven't seen it," Lucas said, not even looking up from his new iPhone, another expensive gift from Marcus, courtesy of Mom's allowance. "Nope, no idea," Noah echoed, suddenly fascinated by his designer sneakers. This went on for 3 days. 3 days of them playing dumb, while I knew, with the certainty of a prosecutor with ironclad evidence, that one of them had taken it. Finally, I'd had enough. While Lucas was at soccer practice, I conducted a thorough search of his room, treating it like a crime scene investigation. The place was a disaster zone. Expensive clothes strewn everywhere, candy wrappers stuffed between gaming consoles, designer posters hanging crooked on the walls. I searched methodically, going through drawers and boxes under the bed and in the closet. And there it was, my evidence. My tablet, wrapped in one of his new Gucci sweatshirts and stuffed in the back of his bottom drawer. The battery was nearly dead, and he'd filled it with game apps and who knows what else. When he got home, the look on his face when he saw me holding the tablet was like a defendant caught in a lie on the stand. "I was going to give it back," he mumbled, his practiced innocence crumbling. "Like hell you were," I snapped, my voice carrying the authority of a judge issuing a ruling. "Stay out of my room and stay away from my things." But they didn't learn. Their sense of entitlement only grew stronger. A week later, I came home to find them both sprawled on our antique Persian rug, my laptop between them, playing some game they'd downloaded. I snatched the laptop away, ignoring their protests like inadmissible evidence. "If I catch either of you touching my property again." The final straw. Then came the incident that would become the final piece of evidence in this family law case. I was walking home from campus one crisp autumn afternoon when I saw them. A woman I'd never met before standing with Marcus next to my father's cherished car, which had been pulled out of the garage. It wasn't just any car. It was Dad's pride and joy, a perfectly maintained classic that he'd spent countless weekends working on, teaching me about engines and oil changes and proper care. My stomach dropped like a case being dismissed with prejudice as I got closer and heard their conversation. "Excellent condition," the woman was saying, walking around the car with an appraising eye. It would be perfect for my commute to the office. "What's going on here?" I asked, my voice carrying the sharp edge of a cross-examination. The woman turned to me with a realtor's bright smile. "Oh, hello. I'm here about the car. He listed it for sale online." I felt like I'd been blindsided by unexpected testimony. "This car isn't for sale," I said firmly, my voice steady despite my racing heart. "It belonged to my father." Marcus's face twisted into that familiar expression he used when a property deal wasn't going his way. "You should be thanking me," he spat, his polished broker facade cracking. "I actually found someone willing to buy this outdated classic. It's not even a luxury brand. No successful real estate professional would be caught dead driving it." I stood frozen as he continued his tirade. "Your father," he practically sneered the word, clearly didn't understand the importance of image in business. "Driving around in this thing. No wonder he never moved up to luxury properties." The confrontation. I turned to the woman, who was hovering uncertainly near the car, like a witness caught between conflicting testimonies. "I'm sorry, but you've been misled. This car is not for sale. It never was, and it never will be." My voice was calm, but carried the finality of a Supreme Court ruling. "I suggest you look elsewhere." She glanced between Marcus and me, clearly sensing the tension, then nodded and hurried away. I didn't wait to watch her leave. Instead, I got into my father's car, backed it carefully into the garage, and turned to face Marcus, who was practically vibrating with the same rage I'd seen him display when losing high-value property listings. "Give me the garage keys now." My voice was as firm as a judge's gavel. "And don't ever go near my father's car again." His face contorted with fury as he yanked the keys from his designer suit pocket and threw them at my feet. They clattered against the concrete driveway as he stormed off, muttering what sounded like threats about property rights. The kitchen showdown. That evening, Mom cornered me in our gourmet kitchen, her face set in an expression I'd seen on hostile witnesses. "How dare you speak to Marcus that way?" she hissed. "Do you have any idea what kind of problems you're creating for yourself?" I set my glass down on the marble counter with more force than necessary. "Problems? You want to talk about problems? How about him trying to sell Dad's car behind my back? How about him insulting Dad's memory? He was just trying to help. That car is just sitting there. That car," I cut her off with the precision of a well-timed objection, "is mine, just like this house is mine, and I've had enough. Marcus and his sons need to leave. I'm done with the fighting, the stealing, the disrespect. I'm done with all of it. You're kicking us out?" Mom's voice rose to a pitch I'd never heard before. "Your own mother?" "No, Mom, not you." I took a deep breath, like preparing for a closing argument. "You can stay. You're my mother, and this was your home too. But Marcus and the boys need to go." She stared at me like I was a stranger in her courtroom. Then her face hardened into something unrecognizable. "If they go, I go." The words hit like an adverse ruling, but I stood my ground. "That's your choice." The departure. They were gone by the next afternoon. I watched from my father's study window as they loaded designer suitcases and shopping bags into Marcus's leased BMW and Mom's new Mercedes, another recent purchase from my father's allowance. Mom didn't even look up at the house, didn't say goodbye. The scene felt like watching the conclusion of a particularly bitter property dispute. Legal consultation. After they left, I sat in Dad's study, surrounded by his law books and family photos, trying to process everything that had happened. But one thought kept nagging at me like an unresolved legal question. This wasn't over. Marcus wasn't the type to accept a loss without an appeal. I needed help, professional help. The next morning, I called Dad's old friend and law partner, James Wilson. He'd handled Dad's will and had always told me to contact him if I needed anything. We met in his downtown Boston office, the city skyline visible through floor-to-ceiling windows. "This is serious, Audrey," he said after I explained everything, his tone carrying the weight of 30 years of legal experience. "Your mother has no legal claim to the property. Your father's will was ironclad. I should know. I drafted it myself. But if she decides to file a lawsuit—" "She wouldn't," I started, but then stopped. These days, I wasn't sure what Mom would do. "Legal battles are expensive," James continued, leaning back in his leather chair. "Even if we win, and we would win, you'd spend a lot of time and money fighting this in court, not to mention the emotional toll." He studied me over his reading glasses. "My advice: try to resolve this before it escalates to litigation. The legal battle begins." James' prediction proved right sooner than I expected. 2 days after our meeting, my phone rang during constitutional law class. Mom's name flashed on the screen. "I'm filing a lawsuit," she said without preamble, her voice cold and unfamiliar. "For division of property. You can't just throw us out on the street." I stepped out of the lecture hall and contacted James immediately. "Let's try mediation," he suggested, his voice carrying years of experience in family law disputes. "Get everyone in a room with a neutral third party. It'll be cheaper and faster than litigation." The mediation. The mediation was set for the following week at James' firm. I arrived early with him, watching the Boston skyline through the conference room windows. Soon Mom walked in with her lawyer, and predictably, Marcus in his finest suit. He couldn't resist being part of any property negotiation. James took control of the meeting with the authority of a seasoned litigator. "Let's be clear about what we're dealing with here," he began, spreading out documents on the mahogany conference table. "Mr. Parker's will was ironclad. I drafted it myself with one of the best estate planning teams in Massachusetts." He walked them through the legal details with precision, his voice calm but authoritative. "The house, the car, everything was left to Audrey. Mrs. Parker, you received a generous monthly allowance, which you're still getting. There's nothing here to dispute." Mom's lawyer shifted uncomfortably in his chair as James continued. "A lawsuit would be expensive, very expensive. Audrey has the resources to fight this as long as necessary. Do you?" He looked directly at my mother. "Are you prepared to drain your allowance, possibly go into debt, for a case you can't win?" Marcus jumped up, his realtor's composure finally cracking. "Of course she wants to continue. We're not going to let some spoiled brat." "Mr. Stevens," James cut him off with the precision of a skilled cross-examiner, "you're not a party to this discussion. I'm asking Mrs. Parker. In fact, I think it would be better if you waited outside. The resolution." Marcus's face turned that familiar shade of red as he stormed out of the conference room, slamming the door so hard the framed law degrees rattled on the walls. In the silence that followed, I watched my mother. She looked smaller somehow, older, like a witness whose testimony had just been completely dismantled. The fight seemed to drain out of her. "The monthly allowance continues for life," James reminded her gently. "That's $33,000 every month, guaranteed. But legal fees could eat that up for years to come. Is that what you want?" Mom looked down at her manicured hands, then at her lawyer, who gave a slight shake of his head, the universal sign of a lost case. "No," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "No, I don't want that." The paperwork was ready, a document acknowledging the terms of the will and waiving any future claims. Mom signed it without meeting my eyes. Before she left, I handed her an envelope. "This should cover 6 months of rent," I said, feeling like I was delivering both a verdict and an olive branch. "To help you get settled." She took it without a word. Epilogue. That was 3 months ago. The Victorian house is quiet now. Actually quiet. Not the tense silence of those last few weeks with Marcus and his sons. I'm focused on my law studies, maintaining a spot on the dean's list while working part-time at a legal clinic. Dad's classic car sits in the garage, polished and maintained just the way he taught me. I worry about Mom sometimes. I know she still has her allowance, and if she's careful with it, she'll be comfortable. But I also know Marcus's taste for luxury hasn't changed. I've heard through mutual friends about their weekend trips to Nantucket and shopping sprees at high-end boutiques. That's her choice, though. Like we learn in contracts class, we all make our own agreements and live with the consequences. Sometimes when I'm studying late in Dad's old study, surrounded by his law books and the quiet dignity of our family home, I think about how life can change as quickly as a judge's ruling. But I also think about what Dad taught me, that some things, principles, memories, self-respect, are worth fighting for, even when the cost is high.